Walk into any big fishing store in America, and the first thing that reaches you isn't the smell of cutbait or the hum of an aquarium pump. It's the color. A wall of soft plastics and crankbaits running the whole length of the aisle. Every shade you can name and 100 you can't. Bubblegum, electric chicken, watermelon red flake. It looks like a candy store built for fish. Here's what the man at the register will never tell you. Most of that rainbow was never built for the fish. It was built for you. That wall is a sales tool, wearing the costume of a science. And it's only the first layer of something much larger. A retail system designed to keep you spending, to keep you a little confused, a little overwhelmed, and quietly convinced that the cure for a slow morning on the water is one more thing in the cart. Today we take that system apart, store by store, and rank the 10 places Americans buy their tackle worst to best. Not on how tall the waterfall is or how big the fish tank is, on what they actually hand you when you walk out the door. Real gear, honest prices, knowledge you can trust, and the kind of edge that puts a fish in the boat. Some of these stores are feeding you a dependence you didn't know you had. A few are handing you the exact knowledge the industry would rather stay buried. And the place that takes the #1 spot isn't the biggest, the brightest, or the cheapest. It's the one most fishermen drive right past without a second look. We start at the bottom. Number 10, the mass market machine. Picture a contractor who needs 1,000 light fixtures, so he tells 5 factories to fight each other for the order. Lowest bid wins, and everybody knows the game going in. That's roughly how the biggest discount retailers in America buy their fishing tackle, through a kind of reverse auction where the store writes the specifications and the manufacturers undercut one another for the contract. Now here's the part that should make you look twice at that $40 combo on the rack. To win an order that size, a well-known tackle brand will quietly build a cheaper version of its gear just for the mass market shelf, sometimes wearing the exact same model name as the rod the pros actually fish. Lighter materials, wider tolerances, the kind of internals that feel perfectly fine under the fluorescent lights and then let you down the moment a real fish leans on them. The famous name on the box is a promise the guts inside don't always keep. That's the open secret of bottom-tier retail, and the mass merchants live in it. The big general sporting goods chains belong down here too, for a different sin. Walk into one expecting the old hunting and fishing corner and you'll often find it gone, converted into footwear and athletic apparel, because somewhere in a spreadsheet a square foot of running shoes beat a square foot of crankbaits. Dick's Sporting Goods made that exact choice out loud, shutting its Field & Stream outdoor chain and pouring the real estate into its experiential house of sport format, rock walls and turf fields where the tackle used to live. The same company spent $20.25 buying Foot Locker. That tells you where their heart went. For pure commodities, split shot, bobbers, a cheap spool of mono, these stores will do. For the rod, the reel, the lure that actually has to perform, you are shopping in the wrong building entirely. And the store at number 9 wants you to forget all of that with a waterfall. Number 9, the Wilderness Theme Park. There's a reason a trip to one of the great outdoor megastores feels less like shopping, more like visiting a national park that happens to have a parking lot. The aquarium stocked with native fish drifting behind the glass, the waterfall, the bull elk frozen mid-stride in the taxidermy display, the boat showroom glowing under the lights like a car commercial. It earns its reputation as a genuine day out, and that is precisely the point. Every drop of that atmosphere is doing a job, and the job is your wallet. All that theater carries enormous overhead, and overhead has to be paid for somewhere, so the gear tends to sit at full sticker price with very little room to move. You aren't just buying a reel. You're buying the waterfall it gets to stand next to. When the 2 biggest names in the business combined, Bass Pro absorbing Cabelas in a deal worth roughly $5 billion completed in 2017, plenty of longtime customers started to notice the house brand gear they'd trusted for years growing scarcer on the shelf, and a familiar identity quietly thinning out. Here's the forbidden part, the thing all that spectacle is built to keep you from noticing. Because these giants sign exclusive, high-volume contracts with the major national manufacturers, their walls fill up with the safe, the mass-produced, the heavily advertised, the niche custom baits, the regional color runs, the strange little finesse tools that actually trigger a fish who has seen every standard lure in the county. Those almost never make the planogram. The bigger the store, the narrower the real edge it's able to sell you. Beauty up front, sameness on the rack. The store at number 8 throws out the theater completely, and it's a better place to shop because of it. Number 8, Academy. The quiet value Play Academy Sports and Outdoors is not going to sweep you off your feet. There's no Ferris wheel and no cascading water. What there is, especially across the South, is a store that pays attention to where it actually sits. Saltwater gear stocked heavy near the coast, deep base selections moving inland, an inventory shaped by the water nearby instead of by a buyer sitting in an office 3 states away. And here's a piece of knowledge worth a great deal more than the price tag lets on. Academy's house brand H2OX, the line you'll instinctively walk past assuming it's the cheap throwaway stuff, actually covers the whole spread: rods, reels, combos, hard baits, soft plastics, terminal tackle, all of it at a real fraction of national brand pricing. The reason it can undercut the famous names isn't witchcraft. It's that you are no longer paying for a pro angler's sponsorship deal or a national television campaign baked quietly into the cost of the bait. A house brand sitting right next to a famous one can outvalue it dollar for dollar precisely because nobody spent a marketing fortune teaching you to want it. Pair that with a straightforward price match guarantee, and you've got one of the more honest dollars in American brick and mortar. But Academy's little house brand secret is nothing next to the one hiding in plain sight at number 7, where the store label on the box is almost literally a disguise. Number 7, Scheels. The label is a disguise. Step into a Scheels, and you'll get the full spectacle: the indoor Ferris wheel turning under the lights, the enormous aquarium, the whole destination feel of the wilderness megastores. But Scheels flips the script in 2 ways that genuinely matter, and the second one is exactly the kind of thing the tackle industry would prefer you didn't dwell on. First, the place is employee-owned, which means the person walking you through a real selection has an actual stake in whether you ever come back through the door. Second, and this is the reveal, Scheels openly tells you who builds its house brand reels. Their spinning reels are made in partnership with Daiwa, carrying Daiwa's own technology right inside them: the lightweight frame, the sealed bearings, the digitally cut gearing. Their line counter reels are built in partnership with Okuma. Sit with that for a second. The store brand you'd reflexively dismiss as second-rate is premium Japanese engineering, wearing a Scheels nameplate, and that points straight at the single most useful secret in all of retail. House brands are very often built in the same factories, on the same production lines, as the premium names sitting on the shelf right above them. The buyer simply slaps a different label on the same guts and prices it lower. Most stores are happy to let you assume their house gear is junk so the math stays foggy. Scheels just tells you the truth and lets you pocket the difference. The store at number 6 has no factory secret to share. What it has is older than that, and you cannot manufacture it. Number 6, Sportsman's Warehouse. Built by people who fish, there are no animatronic moose at Sportsman's Warehouse. What there is, more often than not, is a counter staffed by people who actually fish the same water you're about to fish, regional gear chosen for regional reality, and the easy, unhurried confidence of someone who can tell you what the bite's been doing without first checking a screen. But walk a little deeper into the store and look for the thing hanging on the wall that no big box algorithm on earth can replace: the community board. Index cards and thumbtack snapshots of last week's fish, handwritten catch reports and water updates posted by the very people who were standing in that water yesterday. That board is crowdsourced fishing intelligence, the exact same idea every slick app is now racing to package and sell back to you, except here it showed up first, it's free, and it was posted by your neighbors. Prices sit a touch above rock bottom, but the trade is honest. You give up the lowest possible sticker, and in return you get a human being who actually knows things. Hold on to that idea. Local water turned into usable knowledge, because at number 4 it gets aimed like a weapon by a piece of software, and the result is going to change the way you think about that rainbow wall from the very first frame of this video. Number 5, the digital arsenal. There's no brine in the air here and no creak of dockboards underfoot. The high-volume online tackle houses, Tackle Warehouse and Tackle Direct chief among them, are screens and warehouses, and for the serious angler that isn't a downgrade at all. It's a backstage pass. The moment you erase the limits of physical shelf space, you can finally stock the deep catalog no storefront could ever justify: the niche brands, the rare color runs, the oddball terminal tackle that never earns its keep in a building paying rent. If a lure starts catching fire on the tournament circuit, this is where it tends to surface first, often in every size and shade before a brick-and-mortar store has even heard the name spoken out loud. The logistics get quietly clever too. Delicate graphite rods shipped inside rigid tubes so they actually survive the journey, and free standard shipping once your order clears a modest minimum. The catch is real but narrow. You can't hold the rod, can't feel a reel's balance settle into your palm, and a back order can leave you waiting on the season. You trade touch for selection, but the gear the pros are genuinely throwing lives in these catalogs far more than it ever lives under any waterfall, and the store at number 4 takes all of that selection and aims it with something close to a microscope. Number 4, Shop by Lake. And the science on the shelf: most online stores hand you an endless grid of baits and wish you luck. Omnia Fishing built something fundamentally different, a shop-by-lake system that turns the whole model inside out. You tell it your water, and it pulls together lake-specific conditions, seasonal patterns, and reports from anglers who actually fished there, then points you toward the baits that have been producing on that one exact body of water right now this week. And this is the moment to finally talk about the truth that Rainbow Wall has been hiding from you, because it isn't an opinion, it's biology. Researchers at the University of Illinois, in a 2018 study published in the journal Current Zoology, mapped the eye of the largemouth bass and found something the lure industry has every reason in the world to gloss over. A bass is not seeing the candy store that you are seeing. Its eye carries only two kinds of color receptors, one tuned to green and one tuned to red. That is the entire palette. To a bass, those endless racks of blues and purples and exotic designer hues very likely collapse into one muddy, indistinct sameness. Then add water to the equation and it narrows even further. In clear water, red light is the very first color to die, washing out into plain gray within the first 15 to 25 feet of depth. So that 20-foot wall of color back at the megastore, the one that pulled you in the door. An enormous share of it exists to catch the eye of the human holding the wallet, not the fish holding station down on the bottom. That is the quiet scam the whole industry quietly leans on, and it's exactly why a tool like Omnia rattles the establishment. It drags the decision back to the water and the real conditions instead of the marketing department. Fittingly, in 2025, the operation tied its order fulfillment to a legendary Minnesota tackle shop, Thorn Bros, sharpening the in-stock reliability that raw data alone can never ship, while its loyalty tier hands back 10% of your spend in store credit. The old line between a tech platform and a tackle shop is dissolving right in front of us. Number 3 takes that same hard truth that the answer was never the flashiest bait on the rack, and it shrinks that truth down past the point most American anglers are even willing to go. Number 3, the forbidden imports. What if the real secret to the biggest, smartest, most heavily pressured bass in your lake was to make your gear smaller, a lure the size of your fingernail riding on line barely thicker than a human hair? That's the Bait Finesse system, BFS for short, and the specialized Japanese import retailers, the Bait Finesse empires and the Digitakas of the world are about the only places that truly stock it. Walk into a mass market store, and you won't find this world at all, which is the precise reason it stays an edge for the people who do. Think hard about what relentless fishing pressure does to a bass. It sees the same chunky half-ounce jigs, the same loud, splashy presentations, day after day after day until it learns to file them away as background noise, the same way you've learned to tune out a billboard you drive past every single morning. A tiny, natural, vulnerable-looking bait slips in underneath that learned suspicion. It doesn't read as a lure, it reads as an easy, careless meal. Japanese tackle gets engineered to tighter tolerances and lighter weights specifically to make those micro-presentations castable in the first place, and importers like Digitaka let American buyers order straight out of Japanese warehouses, sometimes for less than the very same reel would cost on a domestic shelf. It's intimidating for a beginner and an outright goldmine for everyone past that stage. But for all its precision, this channel still can't give you the one irreplaceable thing the number 2 store keeps standing right behind the counter, a human being who knows what's happening on the water this very hour. Number 2, the frontline station. They don't look like much from the road. A riverside bait shack, a weathered seaside shanty, a gas station 50 yards from the boat ramp with a hand-painted sign and a cooler full of shiners, no grand architecture, no infinite catalog, but they hold one card that no megastore and no website can ever play. They are standing directly on top of the fish. You'll pay a convenience premium for a simple pack of hooks in a place like this, and reading that as a ripoff is reading the whole transaction wrong. You aren't really buying the hooks, you're buying frontline intelligence. The people running these little stations are very often working guides and lifelong locals in constant, all-day contact with the anglers coming straight off the water. They can tell you what's moving, where the clarity went after last night's rain, which exact stretch of shoreline turned on at first light, and because they sit right at the water's edge, they are the natural home for the one thing that's nearly impossible to ship: fresh and lively bait, minnows and shiners and night crawlers and frozen mullet, kept alive right where you need them. Perfect freshness and a real-time report, handed over with your change, which leaves exactly one place still standing, the one the corporate giants, for all their billions and all their algorithms, genuinely fear. Number 1, the local independent tackle shop. The billion-dollar chains are not afraid of one another. They are afraid of the little shop with a single location and a hand-lettered sign in the window, and they are right to be, because it offers something their enormous scale physically cannot reproduce. A local owner curates that shelf block by block, water by water, stocking only what genuinely works on the lakes and rivers out the front door. They partner with garage builders and hand tires and custom rod makers to carry color patterns, soft plastic pores, and regional flies that will never once appear on a national planogram. Picture Thornbros up in Minnesota, hand-building custom rods tuned to a single angler's arm length and casting stroke, a thing no factory line on the planet is set up to offer. Picture the way these shops fold conservation right into the business itself. Down in Alabama, the Restock Alabama effort, driven by local businesses working alongside the state's own fisheries division, has been releasing largemouth fingerlings back into the Coosa River system, tens of thousands of young fish in a single stocking event on Logan Martin Lake, rebuilding the very resource their customers live for. Or picture a place Coop's Bait and Tackle, where the late Cooper Gilks has spent decades behind the counter and at the tying vise, the originator of a floating sand eel fly that anglers up and down the coast have trusted since 1985. And here's the part the megastores simply cannot survive having said out loud. When you spend at a local independent shop, the money doesn't evaporate to a headquarters in another state. Civic economics, studying real businesses in the Andersonville neighborhood of Chicago, found that local independents generate roughly 70% more local economic impact than their chain competitors, measured both per dollar of revenue and per square foot of store. Out of every $100 in sales, far more circulates back through local wages, local suppliers, and local taxes than the same $100 spent at a chain. That isn't a warm feeling, it's measured. The independent shop is the last place the suppressed knowledge actually survives, the place where a beginner gets welcomed instead of processed, where the truth about what really catches fish is handed across the counter for free because the person handing it to you has to look you in the eye again next week. The rainbow wall sold you a costume. The little shop sells you what underneath it. Outro. So here's where the countdown leaves us. Your gear matters, but who you hand your money to decides something bigger than your tackle box. It decides whether you stay a customer the industry can quietly manage, confused and forever rebuying, or whether you become an angler who actually knows the water. The big machine profits from your uncertainty. The cure was never a flashier lure, it was knowledge, the people willing to share it. So scale down when the lake's been hammered. Match the water, not the marketing. Read the label on the box like it might be a costume, because sometimes it absolutely is. And whenever you possibly can, spend where the knowledge actually lives, with the data, with the importers, with the shack on the bank and the shop that knows your name. This is Forbidden Lures. We'll keep digging up what the industry buries. Subscribe, and come find out what they don't want you to know next.